So my name is Heather Meadows Adamson. I'm a premium tutor here at Appleroot. I've been with Appleroot for about 5.5 years now. And one of my favorite things to do is to give these presentations to kind of help demystify some of these things for students and families. So tonight we're going to talk about what juniors need to know about the SAT and ACT. I am going to interpret juniors as people currently in their junior year. So that's class of 2024. And some rising juniors that are going to be juniors next year. I have a feeling we have some of those as well. So that'd be class of 2025. So I'll kind of speak to both of those years about, what specifically we're thinking about here. So a little bit about Appleroot first. Appleroot, we really believe that, to change a student's self-beliefs is really the kind of long-term effects you can have on a student. And we really work towards building skills for school and beyond, not just academic tutoring, test prep, and executive function coaching, but also working again on confidence and just general skills you can move forward with and, through college and the workplace and so on and so forth. So again, tonight what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the basics of the SAT versus the ACT, the differences between those two tests, how they get prepared for those tests, updates in the world post-pandemic, and then there'll be questions at the end as well. I just ask that you keep most of your questions until the end. More likely than not, I'll answer a lot of the technical ones. So it's best if you just hold on to those till the end, and then we'll have some good time for questions there. All right, so let's get started with the meat of this, SAT versus ACT. So structurally, these two tests are honestly really similar. The SAT and the ACT both have a reading section where you read a passage and answer questions about it. They both have a writing English section. That's where you read a passage and you correct the grammar, the punctuation, things like that. They're both going to have math sections. The SAT has a math with no calculator and a math with a calculator. And then lastly, interestingly, we do have a science section on the ACT, which is different. There's not any of these on the SAT. And we'll talk about that a little bit. And then the ACT still has an optional essay. The SAT no longer has it. So, the ACT's essay is kind of something we kind of expect to be dropped anytime soon. So as far as that goes, you would know if you had to take that. So if you guys have any questions about the essay, I would lean toward don't take it unless you're told to. Both tests are about the same time length without the essay, about 3-ish hours or so. So again, a lot of it is really similar through structure and time. Most of the content is going to overlap as well. So, you have things like reading skills, English grammar skills, graph reading, interpretation, some core math like algebra, stats, and geometry. The SAT is a little different. You're going to be a little more heavy on reading. And by that, I mean that the reading passages can be more difficult, right? We could think of passages that are from an older era, passages that are just more complex, maybe more complex science passages. We also have more math word problems, and so there's more reading in the math section as well. The ACT, on the other hand, has more advanced science. By that, I mean there is a science section. We'll talk about it in a minute. And you do have a little more background science knowledge and more advanced math. And by that, I mean a larger variety of math questions. And again, we'll talk more specifically about that in a minute. One of the biggest things we really have is the amount of time per question on each test. So the SAT, you're going to have about 33% more time on the writing questions, 43% more time on the reading questions, and 40% more time on the math questions. So again, right, more forgiving timing structure, which can benefit some students, right? If you are a student who is just, you feel like you're a very slow reader, which is totally fine, right? You're just someone who would rather spend more time reading the passage, answering the questions. The SAT could be, more to your talents. But we'll also see it's a more complicated test. As far as how the math itself works. And again, we already talked about the reading being a little more complicated too. So let's start with that math section first. So this is kind of a breakdown of the percentage of questions that cover each topic. So the SAT, you can see immediately 62% of the SAT math questions are algebra. That's really heavily on Algebra 1 and Algebra 2 classes, or whatever their equivalents are at your schools. And what they also do is they're also testing something that we would call math fluency. So not only are these algebra questions or perhaps word problems, but often instead of being given an equation and having to solve it, you are kind of given a situation, a real world situation, and you have to figure out, you have to create the math and then solve the math. which can be a little difficult, right? Not just being given something to solve it. There's a little bit more, again, kind of word problem work behind it. And again, that's why you get more time per question too on the SAT math. The next jump, you'll see the ACT is a lot more geometry. It's still only about 23%, but that's a significant amount larger than the SAT. So, if it's been a while since you've done geometry, you did it freshman year or so, could be worth reviewing, especially if you're taking the ACT, I'm sorry. Again, the geometry is going to be your basics, angles, triangles, shapes, circles, nothing too crazy. But, just not having done it in a couple of years can really make it feel much more difficult. So something to keep in mind that you really may want to work on or review. The arithmetic data analysis, those are stats, things like that, about the same. A little more trig on the ACT than the SAT as well, and that goes in with the geometry. So, you'll see some trig on some of the geometry questions as well. So the math content is more evenly distributed on the ACT, right? That's kind of what makes it a little bit more difficult as far as the math section goes for some students, because you get questions from a variety of topics, not just these topics, but also questions on probability and sequences and matrices, kind of some more big, wider range they're pulling from here. The SAT really relies heavily on algebra, but as we talked about, it can be more of that word problem structure. So, one really isn't necessarily harder. It's really preference for your student, what they prefer in the first place, what they are better at. So maybe if your student's here right now, or you are a student watching this and you heard me say more geometry and you're like, absolutely not, maybe you should be leading towards the SAT then. So kind of, use these things as you go forward. Next, we have the reading section. So even though the ACT is faster, right? We talked about how the time per question is really different. The ACT, you are doing 40 questions in 35 minutes. It's a very quick section, but the difficulty level of the passages in the reading section is a lot more consistent. So you are reading kind of more of National Geographic difficulty level, stuff you'd find in popular science, kind of magazine article levels of difficulty. They're a little bit shorter, but again, very fast. On the other hand, the SAT, right, it's a really long section. It's 65 minutes of regular time, over an hour. But you do see spikes of difficulty, right? You get more complex passages. You can get older passages from the 1800s and stuff. So again, it's kind of a balance. What would you prefer? Would you prefer to work on your timing, or would you prefer to work with older passages? The ACT Science is kind of its whole thing. It's right, again, there's nothing like this on the SAT, so it's a little bit different. And what's interesting about the ACT Science is it's not really testing if you're good at science or not. So if you're a student who's always been really good at science and you took an ACT and you felt kind of upset that you didn't do super well, it's not you. Do not worry. The ACT Science section is not testing what is the chemical equation for this, how do you calculate this, all those things. It's more testing, if we're giving you a description of an experiment, we give you some data from that experiment, can you interpret it and tell us about the results from that experiment? This one we have on the right-hand side of the page is talking about cyanobacteria and its reaction to various frequencies of light. Definitely not something they teach you in class, right? So again, you're just taking the information in the data and you're going to interpret it here. So again, not as much about knowing like all kinds of scientific topics, but being able to interpret data. This one is also pretty fast. It's the same as the reading, 40 questions in 35 minutes. And so the SAT does still have science on it. It's just going to be incorporated into the other sections. So the reading passages are going to be, a couple of them are sciences. You'll see maybe even a chart or two in the writing section, and then the math section, of course, you're going to see more charts and some stats questions. So, right, that was kind of an overview of the two tests. We'll talk a little bit more about how to differentiate between each for your student in a minute. But first, let's talk about, those technical things, logistics of how do you actually go take these tests. So for how to register, pretty straightforward. The SAT is run by the College Board, who also runs the AP exams and the PSAT. So likely if you've taken either of those, you already have an account. And if you are a junior, you probably do. So you've logged onto there before, looked at your PSAT scores before. So that's the same place you'll log on to, and you'll just click register for an SAT, nothing too crazy. The ACT is just a different website, make a different account, and you can register for the ACT there. It is act.org. You do have to register for both of these tests directly through the provider, unless your school is doing it for you. Some schools do provide like school day testing, and that's kind of a different thing. They would probably automatically sign you up there. If you're a student who has accommodations, you do need to work with your school's guidance counselor or disabilities coordinator to submit the paperwork. So you don't submit the paperwork yourself, your school representative does that for you. If you want to take the SAT multiple times with accommodations, you only have to do the process once. What's nice is the College Board keeps it on file. So, you send the application in, let's say they say yes, every AP exam, PSAT or SAT you take with them from now on, you'll get those accommodations. The ACT is a little bit different. You do have to reapply for every ACT you want to take. So if you're taking an ACT in June and an ACT in July, you have to send in 2 separate applications. So just be aware that it takes a little bit of time to process. So definitely don't leave all this to the last minute, especially if you are someone who needs accommodations. Go ahead and start thinking about when you want to take these tests ahead of time so you can have all these applications in. As a reminder, colleges cannot see if you've taken a test with an accommodations. That's against the law. So if you are someone who is afraid that that will like hurt your chances, absolutely not. It's better for you to take your test with the accommodations that you are supposed to have, right? And do the best you possibly can on the test. Super scoring is something that's really great. So let's say you do take the test multiple times, right? So it allows you to combine top section scores from different test dates to get an overall composite score. That's kind of like what I call a best of score. So let's say you took the test in March, right? You did pretty good on your verbal. You did really well in your math. You were really proud of that. You felt good about the math. Take it again in May, but you were kind of not feeling well that day. So both of your sections went down. That's okay. Then you take it again in June. You've been really working hard to bump up that verbal a lot, and it does go up, which is great. Unfortunately, there were like a weird amount of stats questions and you forgot to review that. So unfortunately, your math went down a little bit. Totally fine. What happens is the SAT takes your 2 best of scores, and that gives you kind of an all-time best of score. So that would be that 1330 there. So the SAT and the ACT both do this. This example was just the SAT. And so pretty much a lot, I would say, gosh, 95% of colleges will super score. The SAT, a smaller amount super score the ACT. So I would say maybe about 90% of colleges will super score the ACT. But again, that's a really large percentage. The biggest thing to do is always ask or always look it up online. So, we haven't really gotten into this part yet, but I really recommend, especially now if you're a junior, right? So if you're a junior right now, you are going to start applying this fall, or if you're going to be a junior next year, you're going to start working on this kind of stuff as well. So what you want to do is you want to sit down and work on this list of schools that you're going to look at, right? So I really recommend making a Google Doc or a notepad or something that you can work on with your family. Just make a list of schools and, put down things like, do they super score the SAT and ACT? When is their application deadline? All those kinds of things. Having all those numbers in a central place is really helpful, especially as you go forward. You can kind of compare and see, okay, which schools are a reach for me and which are kind of more of a safety school. So this is kind of one of those reasons why that spreadsheet or doc or notebook or whatever it is you decide to use is really helpful. So speaking of effective prep, timelines and best practices. So the first thing you want to do is set realistic goals, right? Find score ranges online. I was just talking about that notebook, right? You'll make with your family. So this is another reason to have it. So what you want to do is you want to look at your list of schools and see what are the scores I need, right? So one thing I really recommend you kind of searching, it's going to be called freshman profile, and then whatever the school name is. Freshman profile for whatever school. Let's say if you want to go to UGA, you put down UGA, whatever. What that's going to do is it's going to pretty much first couple of results are going to be from the school's website. A lot of schools, what they like to do is they like to brag about their most recently admitted freshman class. So they're pretty much all of them are going to have a page on their website that just gives you a bunch of statistics about that class. So they're going to have fun stuff like how many countries they come from, how many out-of-state students, all kinds of stuff like that. But they're going to have more useful stuff too, like those those SAT and ACT scores. So what you're going to see on that page is if they only have one number, it's very likely this middle 50th percentile number. If they have more than one, we're focusing on the middle 50th percentile. That's the middle 50% of students accepted. That's the range that we really want to solidly be in, right? So let's say for one school, this middle 50th percentile is, let's say it's a 26 to a 22. The bottom 25% students is 22 to 16. And let's say the top 25% of students is a 26 to a 32. So as a reminder, the ACT a perfect score is a 36. So let's say these are our ranges, right? So the reason why we want to really focus on being in this middle 50th percentile range, that's our competitive set, right? Those are other students who got in and were competitive enough, right, that they, were able to kind of rise above and get that spot. We don't want to look at the bottom 25% of students. We don't want to say, oh, I just need a 17 to get in. No, those are probably students who are in athletics or their parents gave a bunch of money to the school or who knows what, right? So we're going to ignore those numbers. We're also not going to worry about this top 25% of students, right? This student who probably had a 32 was applying to this as a safety school or something, right? Or maybe they wanted to see if they got a scholarship and wanted to use that to take somewhere else or something. Who knows what, right? We're not telling ourselves we have to get that to get into this school. We're looking at this competitive set. If we can comfortably be in this middle 50th percentile, we're going to have a really good chance of getting in, right? And even better if we get more higher towards it, right? We don't want to just come in with a 22 and expect to get in, right? We want to try to bump it up as much as possible. So again, this is the kind of stuff you want to put down on paper, right? And then then you're going to look at your list of schools and say, does this all align, right? Or is there something I need to bump up? Do I need to work on my scores here? You're going to see other stats like GPA as well. GPA is not as helpful of a determinant anymore because a lot of schools have started to really kind of inflate their GPA. So, some schools you can have a 6.0 or something, which is a little crazy. So that will be on there. And it is something to look at, especially if they're able to break it down by like in-state, out-of-state. But really, we're looking for those test scores to be a nice indicator of where you are in that applicant pool. So again, freshman profile, whatever the school you're looking at is, and then you're going to write down that middle 50th percentile number. And you want to do that for every school that you're interested in. Most websites should have it. If the school for some reason doesn't have it on their website, I would either email their admissions office. Maybe you could even, message them on Instagram or something. Who knows? There's tons of different ways to contact schools nowadays. So now that you're like, okay, I need to get this test. I need to get this score. We want to think about why would we take multiple test dates, right? It's a good idea to do that, right? We recommend that you plan on 3 separate testings, right? We're talking the same test too. There's an initial moment where you decide SAT or ACT, right? So once you've decided SAT or ACT, you want to take 3 of whichever one you've decided on, or you want to plan for 3, I'm sorry. First of all, super scoring, right? You want to see if you can do a best of score. You gain confidence over time, right? That first time you take it, it's just a little nerve-wracking sometimes. It negates any test difficulty or scoring fluctuation. Or like I mentioned earlier, maybe there was more trig than you expected and you totally forgot to review it. Maybe you woke up with a stomach ache. Who knows, right? It also allows you to set incremental goals, right? Let's say you need your SAT score to go up 100 points. You're not trying to do that in one go, right? You say, okay, I'm gonna work on my math this time. I'm gonna work on my reading and writing this time. It allows you to kind of move forward, slowly and not rush yourself. Plan for 3 and stop once you reach your goal. If that's 2, that's totally fine. You don't have to take the 3rd one, right? But you want to have the planning done ahead of time so you're not stressed and rushing for this. So this is one of my favorite pages in this presentation. You have lots of opportunities to take either test, right? And so, let's see. Oops. So let's say, for example, what's kind of nice, you kind of see some nice pairs here, right? So obviously October, November, December SATs is a really nice little set of 3. September, October, December ACTs are also a nice little set of 3. And you got some spring ones as well. You want to think about what your student's doing, right, in each season. Is your student in a fall sport? Do they go away to summer camp every summer, or are they pretty much always in the spring musical? Things to think about, right? So let's say, let's say your student is someone who's in a fall sport and they are going to be a junior next year, right? I'm sorry, they're going to be a senior this upcoming year. Well, you might want to do it sooner rather than later, right? So we're right here in January. So, first step is to figure out SAT or ACT for your student. And I don't know if I've said this yet, but to figure out SAT or ACT for your student, the best thing to do is just to take 2 practice tests, take a test of each, and see which one you get a higher score on, right? If you get a pretty equal score, you can just take the one that you feel better about, right? Or maybe even the one that works better with your schedule if you are someone who is going to be a senior in the fall. If you're going to be a junior in the fall, you have a little more flexibility. But let's say you're a student, right? We're in January right now. You take some practice tests in the next couple of weeks to determine, if you want to do the SAT or the ACT. Okay, let's say it's SAT. Well, if you're taking a fall sport, right here, really great SAT set. Also same right here for ACT, right? And again, you may not take the July one. You may do well enough on the April and June that, you don't need to worry about that guy. Oh, I'm sorry, I realized I was putting January in the wrong spot. It should be right here. Sorry about that. So even more so, right? You even have the February ACT as well you can do. So, even if you are someone who's a junior right now, you're going to be a senior in the fall, you're right on track. You have plenty of time. You're totally fine, right? You have, I do believe it's probably a little late to sign up for the February test. You might be able to get on the wait list at some locations, but this set of dates is a really great set to think about. Maybe you do take a spring sport though, or you're in the spring musical and your schedule is really crazy. That's okay. You can still make it work, right? Most schools, the application deadlines are going to be November, December or so. So you still have some good dates, right? So let's say you're not going to be able to do it, in the next couple months. May is also AP season, so that's not going to work for you. That's okay, right? You still got June. June, both tests happen, which is really great. If you're doing the ACT, June, July, let me circle these, June, July, September are great ACT dates. You'll get that score in time for applications. If you're doing SAT, June SAT, August SAT, October SAT, great dates as well. And if you are going to be a senior in the fall, you won't take the PSAT, so you don't even need to worry about that. So you do still have time, but the biggest thing is being aware that you need to pick these dates right now, right? Because it's time to start doing it, isn't it? If you're planning on taking your first test in April, you need to start thinking about, how do I study for this test? What do I need to review? Do I need to go back and look at my geometry or not, right? And so again, doing this ahead of time is the biggest gift you can give to yourself, is thinking about this schedule, right? By saying, yes, we're going to do the June, August, October SATs. You're not freaking out in May trying to study for your first test in June, right? And you're not freaking out in August or October because you've forgotten about it or anything, right? You're saying, okay, I know I'm taking it in June. I'm going to study some. I'm going to get my scores back. And so in July and the first part of August, I'm going to really study like crazy. I'm going to get my scores up. After that August test, maybe I've gotten what I needed, right? Or maybe I still need to bump up that math some, but that's okay. I'm going to work on that in September, right? You're not making yourself cram too much into a week or a weekend or anything, right? You're giving yourself incremental time to work on things, and you're not stressing about it, right? That stress can make you anxious during the test itself. It can make you really nervous and can affect your performance. And, it leaks into everyone too, right? Probably makes your students stressed, probably makes the parents stressed. So by being here in the first place and thinking about this ahead of time, you guys are in a great spot. So again, we're thinking about what test is better for my student. Again, you take a practice test of each and determine from there. Maybe you already know as well. And you look at a calendar like this and you say, okay, we're going to plan on those 3 right there because of this sport, or they're out here for the summer or whatever. Right. And I kind of mentioned a second ago, but May is also when the AP exams happen. It's often during the same week as the SAT. So if you are taking any AP exams, I would stay away from that SAT. But if you feel like you need to do that one and it has to happen, that's also fine too. Just be aware that it's usually during the same weeks. So it might be a little stressful. But yeah, like I said, a really great page to have here. You want to make sure you register ahead of time. Registration closes, about a month before each test date. So just make sure you're registering ahead of time as well. So make sure you're getting those spots and those seats and stuff. Right. So you have to take practice tests, right? I mentioned you should take a practice test in the first part, right? Just to decide which tests you're going to work on. And then from there, look at that test and look and see, what did I miss, right? What kind of questions did I miss? Did I tend to miss, again, right, all the geometry questions? Did I tend to miss all the questions on the literature reading passage? That can tell you what you need to work on. Maybe you missed more questions towards the end of a section for some reason because you were running out of time, you were stressed, you were tired, right? We talked about that SAT reading section being just really long. Helps you work on those things. Right, so by taking a practice test, that tells you what to do. It gives you focused work to work on, right? Focused things to study. And that's better than just randomly doing things and seeing how you did, right? Actually saying, okay, I tend to miss these kinds of questions. So I need to look at why. I need to look at the answer and see what I've been doing. And so these screenshots are from an Appleruth practice test. If you take a practice test with us, you do get this kind of report that tells you more about, how you did. So, right, we've looked at the tests, figured out which one we want to take. We've seen what scores we need to take for what scores we need for the schools we want to get in. How has that all changed in the past couple of years? So the new world order is largely test option for the most part, right? A lot of schools, I'm going to say 60 to 70% of schools will be test optional. So that means that you can submit your application with or without test scores, and they will consider it complete either way, right? But that doesn't mean a strong test score isn't going to strengthen your application, right? It can still really have a big impact. So there's other things that we've been doing and recommending all along that have technically been optional, right? Taking rigorous classes, taking AP classes, demonstrating interest, rising to leadership positions in your activities and your clubs, winning awards, things like that, right? Technically, you didn't have to do those this whole time, right? But we've been doing things like that because they make a better application. Test scores can be a part of that now. And it's just become a more strategic decision to make, right? About when do I send these test scores? So test optional, right? As I said a second ago, they'll consider an application complete even if you don't have scores. The college will receive some applications without scores and some without. They'll consider them equally. If they have it with test scores, they will look at the test scores, right? Doesn't mean they're going to ignore them if they're not helpful. So if they are going to look at them, if you send them, we want to be strategic about who we send them to, right? Or where we send them to. Something else to think about is there have been a historic number of applications post-pandemic for a lot of reasons. Part of it is, right, not having to send in a test score is really nice. It opens up a lot of barriers for people who couldn't afford to take the test, or who, maybe they consider themselves not very good test takers, and so they feel more confident sending in an application without it, so on and so forth, right? That just means you're getting a lot more applications at school, and now we want to make ourselves stand out even more, right? Even a big school like NYU or UCLA going up by 30% is a lot of people, a lot of applications to look at. And even a teeny school like Colgate, we see how big of a jump that is. I can't imagine the 5-person admissions team at Colgate and how much work they have to do now, right? So that's really changed a lot. So it's also kind of made selectives become even more selective, right? The more applications you get, you still really only have about the same amount of open spaces in your classes each year, right? So, it may not seem like a big jump, but, a place like MIT going from 7 to 3%, that's a lot of people that are being left out, right? Even places like Emory, 19 to 13. Duke, went down a huge amount too. If you look down here at the bottom 3 too, right? 20% to 6.7% for Northeastern. And really the biggest jump I see at the very bottom is Auburn. Auburn went from 80% to 50%. So, 81% of applications accepted is was a pretty big amount. So, for a lot of students, Auburn probably was a safety school, probably was a shoe-in before. Now it's 50-50 whether or not you get into Auburn, right? And that's kind of a crazy change to have. And so, even more, we want to say, how do we make ourselves look competitive here? Ivy admit rates plummeted as well. So again, talking about those differences, doesn't seem like a huge difference between 4% and 3%, but think about just the crazy number of people that apply to Harvard every year anyway. That's just even more applications they have to go through to simply accept the same number of kids they were accepting the year before. With more and more applicants, fewer with test scores and less certainty regarding yield, right? So how many students will actually come. A lot of admissions offices have turned to early decision. So early decision is where you apply to a school, you submit an early application, and you kind of agree to say, if you accept me, I will come to your school. It's kind of like an agreement. Those applications are typically due in October, I believe. And so it's something schools use to kind of get some guaranteed enrollees, right? They say, okay, well, this student's definitely going to come if we let them in. So that's really nice to have, right? So they really turn to that, right? Because, it helps them to fill their classes with more people they, know are going to come to the school. And students like it, students who are pretty decided on what school they want to go to really like it because, it takes the stress away a little bit from that initial thing, right? And to be honest, you have a slightly better chance of getting in as an early decision and application, right? Just slightly better. But if you look at this, right, so look at something like University of Virginia in the middle here, 30% of their freshman class was filled with early decision students. By the time the regular application students were applying, 30% of the spots in the freshman class were already taken, right? So again, even crazier how much more competitive that is on so many levels. So they do still matter for some schools, right? Test scores are a hedge against grade inflation, right? I talked about earlier, a lot of schools have been just really inflating it. And having a 4.0 isn't super special anymore, unfortunately, in comparison to a lot of other students. Test scores are a predictor of how a student will do in college. They're a helpful way to compare a broad, diverse group of applicants, right? So, let's say you're a state school and you have an applicant from a metropolitan area and an applicant from a rural area. Both have about the same, GPA or so. The one from the metropolitan area has about a dozen more activities. They've taken every AP class available. The applicant from the rural area doesn't have a ton of activities, doesn't do a lot of that stuff, but the activities they've done, they've really committed to, right? They don't have as many APs just because their school is smaller and doesn't offer that many. So, at first it may seem this applicant from the metropolitan area looks more appealing, but simply not fair, right? Then if you look at those test scores, you see that student from the rural school really did amazing on this objective test. And, that makes them look like a really good, applicant at the end of the day. So, you can compare people with different backgrounds. Also helps differentiate students who might look similar, right? Let's say you are applying to something like an Ivy. Students who have 4.0s, were president of every club they could have been in, play 10 instruments. They all look the same, really, until you look to the test scores. A student with a perfect 1600 and a student with a 1500, that's the only differentiator. We got to go with the student with the higher score, right? So at the end of the day, it's still helping them make decisions. Not submitting scores can affect merit aid. So many schools still do consider test scores when they are giving out some aid. And as a reminder, testing is still required by public colleges in some states. So these are some of the examples. And as part of some public statewide scholarship programs. So for example, I only know a little bit about some of the southern schools, the southern states. So Georgia, South Carolina, and Louisiana all have state-run scholarship programs. And those do have a minimum testing requirement. So to get that state-run scholarship, in Georgia, for example, it's the Zell Miller Scholarship, which pays 100% of your tuition to any public school. There's a minimum SAT you have to submit, right? And just forgetting to submit that, right? Can you imagine doing that and not being given 100% of your tuition? So things to think about, about your state specifically, make sure you know about that. And your guidance counselor can help you with that as well. It also helps with some school-specific merit scholarships. This is the University of Alabama, for example. So let's say you got in great, you're doing great. You got a pretty good ACT score, but you decide not to submit it. But maybe you should have submitted it, right? Just by submitting this 29 ACT score, you're going to get $15,000 a year. That's crazy. Or maybe it's even worth doing a little bit of extra studying and getting a 30 ACT score instead, right? To get about $9,000 more a year. So these are things to think about. And this is also why that list of schools you're interested in is important, because once you kind of narrow down that list, you're going to go on the websites and you're going to look at stuff like this, right? You find this page, you're like, oh, wow, this changes things a lot. I want to get that 30 ACT score so I can get that money, right? Things to think about here, right? So make sure you're looking up this information about all of those schools and making sure you know your opportunities. And so a relatively small but significant number of colleges don't use test scores at all. This is called test blind. So as a reminder, very few schools really do this. But if you come across a school that does, just keep that in mind. They won't accept test scores at all. So this is a different way of looking at it. In that case, you just simply don't submit them. Maybe you really work on your essay or something else instead. So, okay, all of that. Do I send in my test scores? Are they going to add value to your application? That's what you want to know. Are they something you want the admissions office to see? For example, if you think about, some specific schools, right? Admission rates were similar between those with and without test scores, except in STEM and business, where students with test scores could get in at much higher rates. Doing really well on the math section of the test looks really good, especially if you're applying for an engineering program, right? Maybe you didn't have as many opportunities at your school. Maybe they don't offer AP calculus, but getting a really, really high score in that math section of a test kind of shows your math skills as well. Also matters by major, right? So some students, where they have to audition or something like fine arts or music, probably the score isn't super, super crazy important to them, right? Submitting a score slightly below average probably won't have a huge, effect and stuff like that. So again, you're thinking about what are the programs I'm looking at getting into? Whether to submit depends on your GPA sometimes, right? Average scores may weaken your application if your GPA is great. Maybe again, you just are a bad test taker, or you get really anxious or something like that. Average scores can really bring down all the work you've done on your grades. On the other hand, students with test scores well below their grades will not likely benefit from submitting their scores, right? Sorry, same thing. So, right, test scores doesn't really match your grades. On the other hand, students with better test scores than grades can get a boost from their scores, right? Maybe you really had a lot of stuff going on freshman and sophomore year. Maybe you had some personal problems or something, and your GPA just really, really sunk as a result. But you've really brought it up since then. Your junior year, you've been doing great. You're getting such good grades, and you've been really working on doing well on those tests. And so those really good test scores can match your improved grades and tell more of a story to that admissions officer, right? So you can think about, does this match everything else I'm sending in? Individual section scores matter too, right? So not all 1400s are created equal, right? Let's say you're applying to an engineering program. You have a 600 verbal and an 800 math on the SAT. That's a perfect math score, by the way. Oh my gosh, it's amazing. Even though 1400 may seem low for that program, 800 math, a perfect score, that's crazy. You should definitely send that. On the other hand, if you only got a 600 math, but you got perfect on the verbal, maybe not something to submit to the engineering program, right? Maybe something to submit to the English program, right? Or the creative writing or the theater or something. But something to consider, right? How do my test scores show my, intended program I'm applying to? The biggest thing is that you can't unsee a weak score, right? So it inevitably becomes part of the conversation if you submit it with your application. So you want to make sure that you are looking at your kind of final scores, right? After you've taken a couple of tests, you're looking at those guys and you're saying, do I want them to see these or not? And making that decision before you send these scores to a school, right? So, it could mean waiting a little bit longer to send your scores until you have everything. That's just kind of what this whole pandemic has changed about this process, right? We don't automatically send all scores. We may wait and consider it until later on and look at the numbers. So we're getting there, I promise. So how about the SAT? There have been some recent changes. So there are no longer any SAT subject tests or an SAT essay. So again, I'm going to say, so the people who are juniors right now, class of 2024, you are completely unaffected by digital testing. Do not worry. People who are sophomores right now will be juniors in the fall, class of 2025. You will be slightly affected by digital testing, that you will probably take the digital PSAT in the fall. And then you'll have an interesting choice. You can continue to take the paper SAT until March of 2024. That's correct. Yeah, March of 2024. After that, you do have the option of taking the digital SAT. So you're kind of an interesting spot where you could take the paper one and the digital one and see which one you like better, see which one you do better on, right? So just something to consider as this starts to come up. I'm sure you guys will be hearing a lot about this from your guidance counselors as well. If you want to know more about the digital SAT, I also recommend AppleRuth does a lot of webinars on it, and we also have a really great blog and newsletter that keeps up to date with all the news on the digital SAT. I'd recommend signing up for those and checking out our website. Okay, thankfully we're ready though, right? Like I just said, we always keep up to date on things, and we've always been on the cutting edge. We currently offer fixed form practice digital SATs and ACTs. As we learn more about this, we will release updated materials, and we'll, again, release updated newsletters, blogs, presentations to keep you up to date on this. If you are a student who's class of 2025 or beyond, you have a sibling who's younger than you. All right, so before we go into the questions, we're gonna have a brief poll put into the chat. So if you guys don't mind quickly filling that out so we can know a little bit more about you guys and how we can help you guys. So I'll just let that be put into the chat really quick if you guys don't mind filling that out for me, so we can kind of see who we have here on our call this evening. All right, awesome. Okay, so now I'll start taking questions from the Q&A function. You should see that on the bottom of your screen. So yes, go ahead and submit your questions here. What else can we talk about this evening? Okay, so I did the first question. When you super score, does the school know how many times I took the test, and do they see my lower scores in the other sections? So the answer is yes, but I wouldn't worry about that, right? So let's say you super score, right? Let's say your super score I don't know, let's say it's a 27 on the English, a 25 on the math, a 28 on the reading, a 22 on the science. I don't know, whatever that is, right? So the way it looks when the ACT sends in that score page, it's going to say like ACT scores for this person. Let's say it's my name, right? At the very front of that page, it's going to have your super score, right? The page they send to colleges. Then below, it's going to have details like this is when they took it in June. These are the July scores. You just September scores, right? So it's just going to have a list of those. So schools will see that, but a large majority of schools aren't going to go in there and be like, well, what they get the first time they took it, right? They're not going to do that. Many schools are just going to say, oh, okay, what's the super score? That's the super score. Awesome, we're going to move along here. Unless you've taken it a weird amount of times, perhaps that would be a little bit strange. Or if there's been a really weird jump in a short amount of time. And by that, I mean a huge jump, right? Like not just an increase from studying, that's totally understandable, right? And they're not going to see an ACT you took 4 years ago, and they're not going to worry about that. But a weird jump, like in between the June and July test, you went from a 17 to a 34. That's a little bit odd, and the ACT probably would flag that in the first place. So for the most part, if you have just taken the test a couple times, you have incremental increases, right? Nothing too crazy, nothing too huge. They're not going to really worry about the rest of it. They're just going to look at that super score that's given on the first page. All right. Does super scoring only apply to the ACT? So no, it applies to both tests. So you can do super scoring for both tests. What is considered a low SAT score? So unfortunately, I don't have a good answer for that one because it depends on, what your student's doing and where they're applying to. So what I would do again is look up the school you're looking at and look at that freshman profile. And then that would be able to tell you, for this school, what is on the lower end of the accepted numbers, right? The different schools are different, right? Looking at an Ivy versus looking at, even just a really prestigious state school, those are just different numbers in the first place. So it really depends on the school. Do most schools accept both the SAT and ACT? Yes, SAT and ACT are universally accepted by all schools. So you really just want to focus on whichever one you feel better with, right? Whichever one you feel stronger with. Yeah. Is one test better for students with ADHD or students who run into test fatigue? That's an interesting question. I'm going to say again, I do still recommend everyone take a practice test of each to start off with, because you not only see if your child is naturally better at one over the other, but then they can kind of tell you which one they feel better about. My just kind of initial impression off of that from tutoring is I would consider recommending maybe the ACT, just because the sections are a little bit more, right? So the reading section on the SAT is 65 minutes. That just seems a little long if you're someone who runs into test fatigue. The ACT does still have a 60-minute section. That's the math section, but it's a little bit different than reading, right, at the end of the day. So I would lean more towards that, but I would still have your student take both to see how they feel about both. But kind of my initial impression would be maybe ACT for that situation. Okay, so if you don't super score, admissions will see only the one test that is submitted. So if you mean that you just take the test once and you send it in, yeah, that's the only one they'll see. If you take the test more than once, then it's going to show you the super score at the top, like I was talking about a minute ago. So it's just going to send everything that's on there no matter what. I believe there is a process you can go through with both organizations to get like a test score completely wiped, but I believe it's really complicated. I think you have to send like a certified letter or something. It's a little crazy. Something worth doing if it really means a lot to you and you are really applying to some competitive schools, but for most people, not really worth doing, and the schools aren't too stressed about it. So another question I often get asked about, and again, I know we're talking to some people who are juniors or rising juniors right now, so it's a little less specific, but something to consider too is, have you taken Algebra 2? So Algebra 2 is really a large part of the math on both tests. So, finishing that up is really important for each test. I'm going to go back to that kind of schedule page I had earlier. See if I can find it. So kind of something to consider when you are making this, the idea of when you're going to take tests and things. There we are. Let's say you are a junior right now. You're going to be a senior in the fall. and you're in Algebra 2 right now. So we're here as a reminder, you're in Algebra 2. Well, that's too long, sorry. You're at Algebra 2 through the end of the school year. And, maybe it could be worth pushing off taking your first test till the summer, maybe even till April or May, right? April, you're most of the way through the semester. You probably have gotten most of your Algebra 2 in. So it could be worth taking your, skipping the February or skipping the March test for now, right? Getting most of Algebra 2 under your belt. And then, do a decent job in April, get used to the test. But then in June, when you really have all that math in your head now, really focusing on math for that time period. So something to consider if you are a junior who's in Algebra 2 right now. Algebra 2 does make up a lot of the tests. So I would consider pushing off your test dates ever so slightly. But again, you really have until about, around October, November to do applications. So you do have these other test dates in the fall that are a part of your options. Okay, so if you take the ACT 3 times, there's no way just to submit one test score. That's correct. Yeah, it automatically gets super scored. Yes, admission will always know you took it 3 times. Yeah, that's right. And like I said, most admissions really don't care either way. They're just going to look at it. If again, and I'm talking crazy selective schools, honestly, not even the Ivies would look at all your past test scores. Like really, really small private schools tend to do something like this. Private liberal arts schools would actually look at your past scores, but most schools really don't mind too much. All right, are there any other questions I can answer? So the biggest takeaways from this tonight, that I want you guys to do next is essentially make your college list, right? Whether that's a notebook, a Google Doc, or whatever, make that list and, and gather information, right? When's the application due? What's the SAT or ACT score I'm shooting for? How much does the school cost, right? That's something also talk about with your family. Where is it? Have we discussed going out of state at all, right? Next thing is, if you haven't already decided, take a practice SAT and ACT. Decide which test to focus on. Then make a schedule. What dates do I want to take these tests? Once I've made that schedule, I want to start thinking about prep. Right? I want to think about, okay, I have this score and I need this score, and that's a pretty big jump. Is it something where I want to get some outside help? Do I want to, take a class or something like that? And of course, at Ruth, we offer private one-on-one tutoring in person in some of our markets, online everywhere. Some of our big markets are going to be Atlanta, Washington, D.C., New York, and Seattle, as well as a couple others. Where do I want to take a group class, right? Do I want to take a class through my school, online, etc.? What do I need to do now? And again, most of the time when you're thinking about prep, like our group classes, for example, start about 10 weeks or so before the official test date they're working up towards. So again, you need to be thinking about this 3 or so months, right, before the actual test date. So making the schedule ahead of time is really the biggest thing you can do to help yourself here. Yeah. All right, are there any other questions? So if you guys don't have any questions, y'all are free to go. Thanks so much for joining us this evening. I hope you guys join us for another webinar sometime to talk about digital SAT, test optional, college admissions, so on and so forth. If you have other questions, though, I'm going to stick around. So please feel free to submit those into the chat or the Q&A box. All right. Well, if you guys don't have any other questions, we'll go ahead and, oh, there's another one. Good. All right. Oops, sorry. Let me clear my annotations. All right. Okay. So someone says test prep is usually 10 weeks out. I would say, yeah. So like I said, that's for like a group class that we would do, for example. So that's if you want to sign up for a class like that. You think about 10 weeks out. Of course, in different situations, we do offer like boot camp style group classes in the summer as well. So that's kind of something where it'll be the 2 weeks before the test. You'd meet pretty much every day or every other day for class, different kinds of things. If you're working with a one-on-one tutor, you could, adjust that as needed too. If you're working on your own, I would still recommend thinking about it at least a month ahead of time. Whether you're going to go to the store and buy a book and do practice in the book or use online materials that you find, still at least a month out, I would start thinking about it. Hopefully you've already taken that practice test and you know what you need to work on. Reason why I would say spread it out is just not to overwhelm your student. It's already hard being a junior. It's hard being a student in the first place. So, not having to cram everything in, saying like, okay, I just need to do about an hour of work each week on the ACT for the next 2 months to really get myself prepped. So much more manageable. So that's why kind of thinking about it ahead of time is better. But our group classes are spread out like that. Yeah, no problem. Happy to help. All right. Any other questions for anyone else here? All right, awesome. Well, we'll go ahead and finish this up. Again, thanks so much for joining us. Hope you guys join us again for something. If you need anything in the meantime, if you look at the bottom of the screen, you have all of our contact information. Feel free to reach out with any questions about SAT, ACT tutoring, helping your student in any way. All right, hope you guys have a great evening.